Welcome to the Toldinstone Podcast. I'm Garrett Ryan, and my guest today is Dr. Gregory Aldrete, a longtime professor at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. He's written a series of books on ancient history and has more in the process now. Has also presented quite a few great courses for the teaching company on topics as diverse as great blunders of military history and ancient Roman movies. Dr. Aldrete, welcome to the program.
Happy to be here this morning.
Oh, well, likewise. So I want us to talk today about the topic of your first book, Gestures and Acclamations in Ancient Rome, which discusses how Roman orators reached their audiences and how, in turn, those audiences responded. So just to begin with first principles, why was rhetoric so vital, so important in ancient Rome?
Well, let's say you were a member of Rome's ruling elite, especially during the late Republic and early Empire. Your life was all about public competition. So you're constantly vying with your peers and rivals for status and prestige. And in this battle, the ability to be a good public speaker was a huge advantage. Urban life at Rome revolved around, it seems like an almost never ending series of public spectacles and rituals and performances. And at each one of those events, speech making had a central role. And there was a whole range of things that went on at Rome. So this would include not only meetings of the Senate, public assemblies, campaigning for political office, but also stuff like entertainment events, gladiator combats, beast hunts, chariot races in the circus, theatrical performances. You also have court trials, funerals, triumphs, religious ceremonies, and festivals. And speechifying was part of every one of those things. So since oratory, the art of speaking before an audience, was at the center of those events, oratory was at the heart of politics and of urban life. And by the way, it's important to note that for a lot of those, let's say, potential oratorical situations, the target audience was the general Roman public. So things like law cases, which I'll be talking about a bit, they were not tried within the confines of a courthouse as they might be today, but instead they would be staged in public spaces such as the Forum or among the nearby colonnades. And huge crowds would gather to watch and, crucially, be entertained by those trials. So rhetoric just suffuses everything at Rome. It's enormously important in all kinds of contexts in ancient Roman life.
Wow, yes, it's more where rhetoric was not important is the better question, I guess. It's just, right, ubiquitous. And so I guess, obviously, having good technique is critically important. This is as much entertainment as anything else you said in some cases.
Mhm.
And so, how much do we know? Obviously, as classicists, we read these things on the page. We see, the Greek or Latin texts, we read them out. And it's easy to lose that these are performative in so many ways. And so I would ask, how much we know about rhetorical practice, about the delivery of these speeches, and what kind of sources do we have on the mechanical side of rhetoric?
Yeah, well, there's certainly all kinds of things that are gaps in our knowledge about the ancient world. But fortunately, this is one area
Hmm.
of ancient Roman life that we actually have quite a lot of information about. So, not only do we have a number of famous speeches in the writings of ancient historians, we have transcripts of a number of those speeches. And in addition, and what's particularly of interest to me, there's a number of kind of practical manuals of rhetoric, how-to books detailing how to be a good public speaker that were written by some of the most renowned orators themselves. And probably the most important of these are three books on oratory written by Marcus Tullius Cicero. These are the De Oratore, the Orator, and another one called the Brutus. And Cicero is really almost our prime example of how important oratory was and could be in ancient Rome. And if you look at his own life, you see this illustrated just very plainly. So Cicero, just to give a little background, he quite honestly was kind of a mediocre general. He had no distinguished ancestors. He came from a family of fairly modest economic means. And yeah, he often struck others as being a bit vain and self centered. But despite all of that, he had an extremely long and successful political career. Eventually, he rises to the very highest elected office in the Roman government, the consulship. And he's able to do this because, despite all his failings, he has one very special talent. And that's an extraordinary ability to get up in front of crowds and persuade them of what he wanted them to believe. In fact, he's usually regarded as the greatest public speaker of all time. And Rome
Mhm.
had no, as you know, class of professional lawyers. Instead, politicians who were good public speakers would be asked to deliver speeches either on behalf of, let's say, the prosecution or the defense in a law case. And the most effective of these so-called lawyers could themselves become celebrities. And this, of course, was Cicero's route to fame. So he gained prominence and renown in the law courts of Rome by exploiting this one real talent that he had, his ability to persuade audiences. And his rhetorical handbooks are enormously useful. I mean, they lay out the training and education for orators. They give practical tips and advice on public speaking. And this includes all the different stages of speech writing. So it's the sort of mental preparation, how to compose them, how to memorize them, because typically they would deliver these things without notes. So you'd have to memorize sometimes a speech that was an hour, hour and a half long,
Mhm.
how to deliver the speech. They really give you an entire philosophy concerning the Roman orator and his role in society. And they also have a wealth of examples drawn from both previous history and Cicero's own extensive experiences. Oh, and one other source that's really important to understanding Roman oratory is this massive 12-volume work on the subject written about 80 years later by Quintilian. Quintilian was sort of the ancient equivalent of a professor of rhetoric. So I would say together it's those handbooks of Cicero and Quintilian's work, which are our main sources for how to be a good public speaker.
Hmm. Yes, so more than you might imagine exists on the technical side of
Mhm.
oratory. And yeah, I remember reading a tiny fraction of the Institutes of Oratory once,
Yeah,
Quintilian's work, and just being astonished by how much there was,
he's
just going on
detailed.
and
He's
on.
very detailed.
He is extremely, you can tell he's a professor. He's someone who's
Mhm.
like, now the next thing to do.
Yep.
Um, and so obviously someone like a Cicero has natural gifts that most speakers don't. He has whatever the it factor is for an orator. But he's also very carefully trained. That there's a long
Mhm.
education behind his technique. And so, what goes into the making of a Cicero or any Roman orator? What is the education process for a Roman youth who wants to become the next Cicero?
Well, really, the main purpose of upper class Roman education and for boys was to prepare young men for this public life that we've been talking about. And because of that central place that oratory held in that life, the main goal of education is to try and produce a effective public speaker. So, in terms of education, Roman boys would study with a whole succession, one after the other, as they got older, of different teachers, learning kind of ever more sophisticated material. So, you start off with grammar and literacy and that sort of stuff, but then you'd move on to studying Roman literature. And one aspect of that, which was essential to their later focus on oratory, was when they would learn literature, a lot of what they would do would be to memorize and then recite very long passages. And that's an essential skill to later being a good orator. And finally, they would get to the sort of a crowning phase of their education, the study of rhetoric. Their initial lessons in rhetoric would involve these little exercises they would do where they would imagine themselves in the place of a famous mythological or historical figure at some crucial episode in his or her life, and then kind of write the speech that supposedly they might have given on that occasion. So a lot of these were about the Trojan War. Imagine you're Achilles debating whether to, withdraw from the battle or participate. What's a speech you might have given? That kind of thing. And eventually, they would move on to compose essays on historical themes drawn from actual Roman history or problems. And there would be a lot of emphasis on their learning effective delivery techniques. So the kinds of stuff that Cicero and Quintilian spend a lot of time outlining.
Mhm. Yes, I remember reading a few of these later stage exercises, and they're controversiae, I think,
Yes, yes.
which are often wonderfully contrived. These bizarre cases, where a weapon's being tried for murder, and
Yeah.
yeah, just wonderful stuff. So there's a very careful process, like I said, almost like a finishing school that every
Mhm.
Roman gentleman's expected to go through. Um, but of course, not everyone becomes Cicero. Only a few, have that it factor, whatever it is. And so, what separates a bad orator from a good one? What are the aspects that made, for example, Cicero stand out from the pack when he was rising up, in Roman politics?
Well, I mean, Cicero has a lot of very specific things that make him a good orator. But in a way, I almost like to sometimes step back from the specifics and look at the underlying assumption that really lays underneath a lot of Cicero's kind of thought about oratory. And I think at the core of Cicero's approach to persuasion is one fundamental concept. And this is the belief that people, especially the Roman public, are primarily ruled by emotions. So, according to the strategy, if you can stir up the emotions of an audience, then all sorts of elements that usually you would think would be important, and this might include stuff like the facts in a law case, evidence, even the truth, suddenly matter much less. And here I like to quote Cicero's own words. So in one of his rhetorical handbooks, he says, to sway the audience's emotions is victory. For among all things, it's the single most important in winning verdicts. And he's talking there about law cases, but this applies to all forms of public speaking. And Cicero would employ all kinds of strategies to achieve that end. So a lot of the things Cicero advocates are really aimed at stirring up the emotions of the audience. And I mean, there's dozens of these. One that I like particularly is where he talks about the use of props and visual aids. So Cicero says that an orator is like an actor in this regard. And just like an actor, he has to prepare the stage that he's going to give a speech from and furnish it with the necessary props. So, for example, prior to one of his very famous speeches, which he gave to the people in the Roman Forum, Cicero arranged beforehand for a new statue of the god Jupiter to be set up nearby. And then during the speech, he would allude to this statue and he would ask, almost challenge the crowd, you know, how can you guys sit there and not take action when right under the very eyes of the god? And so, just as a modern speaker might use, let's say, PowerPoint to provide illustrations to his talk, Cicero ensured that he would have a visual aid available to supplement his words. And we see this all the time in court cases. So Cicero and Quintilian both talk a lot about how orators who were prosecuting violent crimes would always bring into the court and prominently display objects related to the crime. So they might bring in swords encrusted with blood, bits of bone taken from the wounds, and of course the bloodstained clothing of the victims. So all of these are calculated to appeal to the emotions, the sympathy of the jury. And some orators would even take this a step further, and they would commission paintings to be made that would depict the accused person committing the crime in graphic detail. And Quintilian
Oh,
says,
wow.
this sometimes is taking a little bit too far. It's kind of morally questionable, but hey, it works because then you put this vivid, literal image into the jury's mind of the guy committing the crime. And so you think, well, he did it. And Cicero sometimes even extends this to using human beings as sort of living props. So he does this several times, but I think my favorite is one time he's defending a guy who has a newborn baby. And so Cicero delivers the speech defending this man while literally cradling the infant in his arms. So you can kind of imagine Cicero going like, "Ooh, cute little baby! Look how cute this baby is! How could you possibly leave him without a father to take care of him?" And Cicero's comment at the end of this is that the Roman Forum was filled with sobs and tears. So it worked. Appeal to emotion really works. That's just a couple of the techniques that Cicero employed.
Oh, that's wonderful. I actually never heard those anecdotes. And that, boy, how much better our modern court cases would be if we had, these, wonderful dioramas of what
Yeah.
the prosecutor said was going on, human props. Though I think that some of these perhaps underhanded methods get at the fact that oratory, though obviously so central to Roman life, was, at least in some expressions, considered somewhat disreputable, at least as it was practiced by the Greeks or whatever else, by non-Romans. There were, especially in the early days of Republican Rome or early Middle Republic, these occasional frenzies of prosecution against orators. They're expelled from Rome a couple times early on. And this, kind of dies out by the late Republic, by Cicero's day. But there is always this sense that oratory has to be done the right way. And there's always complaints among practitioners that oratory is not being done well. It's being corrupt. It's been vitiated somehow. And so I guess I wanted maybe to address this kind of conundrum where oratory is at once absolutely pivotal to Roman life, but at the same time has this a raffish air, an air of someone being disreputable, not quite one of the learned sciences.
Yeah. Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, you put your finger on one of the big dilemmas facing orators. And there's always that tension between things that are effective and things that are seen as morally questionable. And I think a big source of that anxiety um, comes from the fact that there was another highly visible group at Rome, other than politicians and lawyers, who were using a lot of these exact same rhetorical techniques. And that other group is actors and mimes and
Hmm.
pantomime artists who would appear in theatrical presentations. So these were hugely popular. Supposedly, pantomime was the most popular form of entertainment among the urban plebs.
Hmm.
But few groups in Roman society were more looked down on or maligned than the supposedly immoral, debased, and degenerate performers of the stage. And so any similarities that that group might share with members of the Roman elite would have made the latter very, very uncomfortable. So, just as you say, Roman orators were kind of caught on the horns of a tricky dilemma. On the one hand, there's this desire to deliver a speech in the most persuasive manner possible. I mean, the rewards for that are enormous. But on the other hand, is the necessity to at least give the appearance of maintaining the kind of decorum and restraint expected of their high social status. So the orator had to find that line. To what degree does he engage in theatricality and make his speech more dramatic and effective and audience appealing? Or how much should he try to maintain that kind of aristocratic dignity and reserve? And when you read the oratorical handbooks of Cicero and Quintilian, they really vividly encapsulate this anxiety. And honestly, they have, I would say, almost a schizophrenic attitude towards actors. So you'll read those, and in some places, they'll just lavish praise on actors. And they'll explicitly say, orators can learn a lot by studying actors and what they do and by imitating certain things they do. But then you turn the page, and maybe a page or 2 pages later, they'll vigorously condemn actors. They'll have this screed saying they're the worst people, and there is absolutely nothing that they share in common with orators. So they directly contradict themselves, just back and forth. By the way,
Hmm.
Cicero, I should mention, was friends with several of the most famous actors of his time, and he admitted that he studied their techniques in order to improve his delivery. So yeah, it's a tricky line that orators had to tread. And as you say, rival orators are always accusing one another of engaging in shameful or low practices.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Um, I think of like Quintilian saying that a good orator is what a good man skilled in speaking, right? And that's his famous tag.
Mhm.
And they do that oratory has to flow somehow from the character of the speaker. But everyone knows it's really about technique when it comes down to it. That it's about who's
Yep.
the best at kind of pulling at the heartstrings, whatever else it might be. And then it's all these agonized debates about, whether, Attic or Asiatic style, or X or Y or Z
Mhm.
technique, once they all arise. But thinking more about the actual scenarios in which they're performing these, tricky arts. So you mentioned before how really the audience can often be the entire Roman public, at least notionally. I mean, how large an audience are we talking for someone like Cicero? At a major court case, how many people might be watching him and hearing and listening?
Yeah, well, actually, before I get to size, that point you just made is incredibly correct. So,
Hmm.
orators were just constantly kind of pretending like this just came naturally to them, and that's what made it okay. That's why it was an
Hmm.
aristocratic thing. But really, it's hours and hours of crafted technique. So it's pretending it's one way when it's actually not. In terms of
Hmm.
crowds, the potentially crowds could be very large. The Roman Forum, which is the site of many famous speeches by Cicero and other people, was a big space, maybe 100, 120 yards long, 60, 80 yards wide. And it could hold, 10,000, maybe 15,000 spectators if you include people sitting in all
Hmm.
the basilicas alongside. So that's a huge crowd. And in entertainment venues like the Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheater, or the Circus Maximus, where, yes, politicians and emperors we know interacted with crowds verbally, you could have tens of thousands of people. And this, by the way, is the very aspect of ancient oratory that first got me deeply interested in the topic. So, the majority of my scholarship is really always investigations into practical aspects of life in the ancient world. I like to try and figure out how things actually worked. And way back, 3, 4 decades ago when I was in grad school, I was studying ancient rhetoric just a little bit. And I kept reading these accounts of famous orators like Cicero giving these speeches in front of huge crowds of tens of thousands of people. And I said, I got to wondering, how did that work? Just how did that actually work in an era before any artificial means of voice amplification, like
Hmm.
microphones or loudspeakers? And it turns out that at least a little part of the answer is that Roman orators employed a system of sign language when they spoke. And this helped because it's actually possible, this has been tested, to see a gesture at a farther distance than you can hear a voice. And that especially applies in a noisy or windy outdoor setting, which is, after all, where most of these speeches took place. So my dissertation ended up stemming from this. My dissertation became my first book. And in that, I basically tried to figure out some of this system of oratorical gestures.
Hmm. Honestly, I always wondered myself about, you read about, say, Alexander or Caesar addressing, an enormous army, and you're thinking, what's the guy in the back row getting out of all this?
Yeah.
Just sees, the guy gesticulating. But of course, gesticulation itself, as you're saying, is itself a sort of sign language. So just to ask, the big question that you addressed in your dissertation and then your book, how did Roman orators use gestures as they spoke? In
Yeah.
general
And I
terms, I'll get
mean,
into more specifics. Yeah.
to that
Yeah.
question about the guy in the back of the crowd, as usual, Monty Python gets it exactly right in that scene in Life of Brian, where
Oh,
you have
right.
the
Yeah.
Sermon on the Mount and Jesus is speaking
Hmm.
way off in the distance. But in the back, you have the people saying, what did he say? Blessed are the cheesemakers, and that kind
That's
of thing
right.
is
Yeah.
exactly what went on. So that's absolutely the situation. And we, in fact, have
Hmm.
some sources featuring Julius Caesar once, and our time, I think Pompey, giving speeches where they talk about how people on the fringe of the crowd misunderstood what they heard because you just can't hear that very well. But back to gesture, the key thing about the Roman gestural sign language is that unlike the modern sign language, in which uh, motions function as direct substitutes for words, mostly Roman orators use gestures to add an emotional gloss to their speech. So, in other words, the gesture that a Roman orator made told you how you were supposed to feel in response to the words he was speaking. So, again, it's that emphasis on emotion here. And furthermore, the Romans believed that just witnessing, if you saw certain gestures, it would cause you to experience a specific emotion. So if an orator
Hmm.
knew what gesture to make, he could literally manipulate his audience's feelings. And this might seem a little weird. You might say, well, no, just because someone makes a gesture, it's not going to make me feel something. But think just sort of as an analogy of the effect that music can have on your emotions. So today, if you're watching a movie, let's say it's a horror movie, the filmmakers will, in certain scenes, use, kind of strident, sharp, jarring chords, which will make you feel tense. Or if it's a tragic scene, they'll use strings to kind of make you feel sad. And Cicero knew about this kind of thing with music, and he used this analogy in explaining gestures. So Cicero actually says in one of his handbooks that in the same way that we all know certain musical tones or chords make you feel, sad, happy, tense, whatever, certain postures of the body or hand motions will make you feel certain emotions. And Cicero says the human body is like a lyre, a musical instrument, and the orator has to learn to play his own body to arouse the emotions of his audience. So for orators like Cicero, gestures are a component of what's one of the most important aspects of oratory, and that's delivery. Far too often we read Cicero and we think about them as just text on a page. I mean, this is what happens when you're a philologist and you
Mhm.
focus so much on the language. But these were live speeches given live. And Cicero all the time says, a poor speech with great delivery is going to be more effective than a brilliant speech with bad delivery. And he repeats, and every other Roman author likes to repeat this story about Demosthenes. Demosthenes was regarded as the greatest of the Greek orators. And
Mhm.
one day a guy comes up to Demosthenes, an admiring fan, and says, Demosthenes, give me some tips. Tell me, what are the three most important aspects of effective public speaking? And to this, Demosthenes said, the three most important aspects of public speaking are one, delivery, two, delivery, and three, delivery. So, I mean, they just hammer this notion about what really matters is how you deliver that speech. And when talking about the
Hmm.
use of gesture specifically, Quintilian has a really nice quote, which I pulled. So I want to read this one. So Quintilian says, the hands may almost be said to speak. Do we not use them to demand, promise, summon, dismiss, threaten, supplicate, express aversion and fear, question, or deny? Do we not use them to indicate joy, sorrow, hesitation, confession, penitence, and to measure quantity, number, and time? So
Hmm.
gestures were an integral part of good oratory to the Romans.
Wow. Yeah. It's just, I suppose in our own culture, we kind of overlook all of these culturally specific languages, but music in itself is, of course, a culturally specific language that we see in movies. This thing that, like you said, cues us how to feel and think. And I suppose that, right, the hands being so articulate, I guess anyone we think of modern Italian almost sometimes as
Yes.
retaining some of this. But our own, I guess, slack-limbed English can somehow loses that. Um, so thinking about how this actually operated in practice, I guess how are you able to figure out in your research what they're actually doing? Are they explicit in text, or are you to kind of extrapolate from other sources?
Well, that was the challenge for my dissertation. And I really had two sources of information. So, first, of course, are those oratorical handbooks, mostly by Cicero and Quintilian. And they
Hmm.
do describe some of the gestures used by orators and their meanings. Quintilian, in particular, as you know when you've read him a bit,
Hmm.
Quintilian has this lengthy discussion. I mean, it's almost 40, 50 pages in the Loeb edition of detailed descriptions of gestures. So that was very helpful to me in my research. A big problem with those handbooks, however, is that quite honestly, their verbal descriptions of physical gestures are often unclear or even just downright confusing. So there's pages where,
Hmm.
Quintilian will describe, and then you put the third finger bent slightly by the fourth finger by something else, and you just don't know what he's talking about. So this is where my second type of evidence came in, and that was ancient art. So, in a whole variety of media, ranging from statues to coins, we have contemporary visual depictions of Roman politicians, actors, and orators making various hand and body gestures. So, a lot of what I tried to do was to match up those two sources, to match the verbal descriptions from the rhetorical handbooks with actual examples that we could look at in art.
That's fascinating. One of my hobbies is I'm a very small scale collector of Roman coins. And I remember I've
Mm,
seen a few Sesterti. They have
yeah.
these wonderful ad locutio reliefs in the back that'll
Yes.
have, usually the
Yes. Yeah.
emperor.
Yep.
Exactly, yeah, kind of on a little scaffold or whatever, addressing, usually the
Hmm.
soldiers, the Roman people. And so, right, I guess that putting those two and two together, image and text, must have been a wonderfully fruitful fusion. So I think for many of us, when we think of how Roman oratory must have looked, we think of HBO's Rome, where they have the newsreader, kind of this portly gentleman who, has these very florid gestures as he reads the news of the day, and kind of functions as the Greek chorus almost in those episodes. But from your research, from both image and text, what do we know about these specific gestures that were being employed in Roman speeches?
Yeah, those ad locutio coins you mentioned, that was one of the key sources in my
Hmm.
dissertation, my book. So I talked about a lot of those. But in terms of what some of these gestures were, let me give you an example of what this might have looked like a little bit in a speech. So
Hmm.
in one part of his gesture discussion, Quintilian takes a line from one of Cicero's actual speeches and very, very helpfully indicates exactly where Cicero would have used a gesture in that line,
Hmm.
and it's the opening line of the Prologario. So let me kind of just like perform that line for you in Latin using
Oh,
some
sure.
actual Roman oratorical gestures. So here we go. Noam crimen, Gai Kaiser, et ante hanc diem, non auditum, propinquus meus, ad te, quintus tubero, de tulit. So,
Oh,
a kind of
wonderful.
rough translation would be something like of a new crime, Gaius Caesar, and one that before today had never been heard of, my relative Quintus Tubero has accused you. And in terms of the gestures, so like the one where I kind of push my hands to the left like that,
Hmm.
that gesture was thought by the Romans to convey the emotion of aversion. So you can kind of see that, right? You're almost like sort of
Hmm.
pushing something away you don't like. So if you're talking about something that disgusts you or that's bad, you'll do that one. When I slapped my thigh, it indicated anger. When I clenched my
Hmm.
fist and pressed against my chest, the emotion is meant to convey is grief. So a lot of these are quite natural, right? I mean, you can almost guess what those emotions are meant to be just by the gesture. Now, a lot of the Roman gestures are more sort of arbitrary or a little not as obvious in their meaning. So, one of my favorite, I think one of the most graceful ones, is that one I did where the hand starts like this, you curl the fingers in sequence and then open them outward like that. So,
Hmm.
this one's not quite as obvious, but you can maybe guess it. My students have guessed it sometimes. What do you think this is? What emotion is being conveyed? This is the touchy feely part here of our discussion.
Hmm.
So, any
I know it
ideas?
almost. Yeah, I guess I'm kind of at a loss. Being again that slack-limbed English is kind of maybe like a I don't know. You're being expansive. You're kind of inviting in the audience. Maybe I'm not.
Yeah, okay, you're close. This is meant to be wonder. So something kind of
Okay.
makes you feel wonder or amazement. That's the gesture. So you
Okay.
kind of almost get that, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah. I
the
can see very much
gestures
how
are
that would work.
interesting. Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, that's
And
fascinating.
you had asked about the Herald in HBO's Rome. So I don't want to forget that.
Hmm.
On the whole, by the way, many of the gestures he uses are actual ones attested by Cicero Quintilian. Some are a little not, but most of them actually are. And when
Huh.
I was watching the commentaries on that show created by some of the makers of the show, there's a line where somebody mentions that for that they consulted a book on gestures by a Roman historian. And since I wrote the book that illustrates those gestures, I'm guessing it probably means they might have looked at my book for
Wow.
that one, though I can't, they didn't name me, but I figured it must have been, you know?
Well, that's fun. Yeah. Oh, very cool. Yeah, and I guess again, people of us, those of us who again have been to Italy and kind of seen this in action to some degree, it's much less stylized, of course. But again,
Mhm.
it's supposed to be intuitive. It's kind of, like you said, it kind of illustrates and counterpoints what you're saying, at the same time. Usually a mile a minute if it's in Italian. But fascinating. And so thinking about so
Actually,
Roman
on the
crowds watching these
Italian thing,
things. Oh, go ahead.
you mentioned
Uh
like
huh.
modern Italian people are far more gesticulate even today than other
Mm-hmm.
countries, for example. And in the 19th century, there was a classicist who actually went to Naples and tried to look at then contemporary Italian gestures in the street and linked them up to the descriptions in Quintilian to try and say there was a continuity from 2,000 years of ancient Rome to modern Naples in terms of
Really?
Italian gesticulation. And I don't think it actually works, but it shows that that they were sort of seeing this. And one of my
Hmm.
frustrations with movies, and this is just an aside, is that they tend to cast English actors as upper class Romans. And the English are
Hmm.
some of the least gesticulate people on the surface of the earth today. So I feel like they always leave out that nice aspect of Roman
Hmm.
life that really was part of it. And HBO Rome at least tried to put that back in. So that's good.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that's a good point. I think so often our idea, our mental image of ancient Rome is, either kind of these, stiff marble statues, static and moving, monumental, or right, kind of these dramatizations, which are often very
Mm.
stylized, even Shakespearean sometimes. And right, it kind of leaves the color and the sheer vividness of Roman life off screen sometimes. But anyway, thinking about the effect of all of these gestures and and all of these wonderful deliveries, um, what do we know about the ways in which Roman crowds responded to a good or a bad speech? Did they clap? Did they boo? Did they hiss? What are what's their nonverbal or kind of just sonic contribution to the dialogue between orator and crowd?
Yeah, I mean that's a big part of it too. And public orations are or were highly interactive events. So
Hmm.
crowds would express their agreement or disapproval to the speaker quite vociferously in ancient Rome. So they would indeed shout, they would applaud, they would boo, they would hiss, they would jeer, they would yell abuse. They would even do things like throw objects. So there's plenty of examples of crowds pelting orators with rotten fruit, moldy bread crusts, and of course, sometimes rocks or often roof tiles, which is one of the handy urban weapons in the ancient
Mm-hmm.
world. And sometimes they would riot. Crowds also had an entire system, formal system of shouted chants called acclamations, which had
Hmm.
certain well known formulas and which audiences could employ to make known their reactions or to make requests. So when we think of a Roman oration, it was a lively event. And that's another reason why they came to be viewed as a form of public entertainment. And I suspect that one of the things that made Cicero such a good orator, talking about well, why did he stand out, is that he was probably quite good at
Hmm.
dealing with hecklers. We certainly know from his speeches that he had no hesitation whatsoever about employing personal invective and kind of ruthlessly mocking his opponents and doing so on the spur of the moment. So there's a couple examples where we know he would kind of make jokes at people's expense that clearly just occurred to him right at the moment, or where he's even using elements
Hmm.
of the environment. So I think being sort of light on his feet, quick thinking, and responding to these kind of spontaneous things that would happen was another aspect of why Cicero was so effective.
Hmm. Yeah, and so the things can really go south pretty quickly in this sort of
Mm.
very animated environment where people have roof tiles on hand, or dung to throw, whatever else.
Yeah.
And so I guess do you have any examples really of it as a truly catastrophic speech? Where the orator either just incited the crowd to violence, or they just really hated him for whatever reason, and things fell apart.
Yeah, I mean, that happened a lot. We have quite a few examples of orders literally having to flee for their lives. And just as there were good orders, we've been talking about, there's bad ones too.
Mm,
If we just stick with gesture, so kind of been focusing on gesture, let me use that as an example of some bad examples of gesture. Because while properly used gestures could obviously enhance the power of a speech, there's also a big danger that gesticulating too much or in an undignified manner would undercut the power of the speech, make
hmm.
the orator look silly, and destroy the effectiveness of the whole thing. So, for example, there was there was one orator who obviously was just in this habit of kind of violently flailing his arms around when he spoke, and this caused people to say that whenever he gave a speech, it always looked like he was being attacked by a cloud of flies. This was kind of going like this. And another guy said the same orator that anytime he watched him give a speech, he felt like he was watching a man trying to balance in a wave tossed boat. So that's not good. My favorite
Right.
example, though, maybe a most embarrassing one for an orator too, was the case of an orator named Sextus Titius. And apparently, this guy would habitually sway from side to side whenever he was giving a speech, but he would do it in this kind of supple, languid way. And this resulted in a popular dance of the time being named the Titius. So people would do the Titius in imitation of this orator who had this bad body language when giving speeches. So too much gesturing could definitely get you in trouble, but not using gestures would cause your audience to get bored. And this was a big problem also. So there's another quote I pulled that I'll read you this one. This is Cicero critiquing another orator named Marcus Calidus. And what Cicero says is, "You, Marcus Calidus, there was no trace of agitation in you, neither of mind nor of body. Did you once smite your brow? Did you slap your thigh? Or at least stamp your foot? No. In fact, so far from touching my feelings, I could scarce refrain from going to sleep on the spot." So if you
Huh.
don't gesticulate, it's bad as well. And in another place, Cicero says, if you're a good orator, by the end of your speech, your toga should be all disheveled because you've been doing all these
Huh.
gestures, and you should be soaked in sweat. So that's a sign of you've put in the right effort, that you are using this kind of body language. And Cicero would praise also orators who do a good job. There's a nice example where he says of one guy, "Your wagging finger made me tremble with emotion." So there's a couple examples of both good and bad in terms of how to use body language.
Those are wonderful. Doing the Titius, boy, I know how I've made it this far in my life without knowing that little that little tidbit about ancient Rome. Um, and like you said, that it's a fine balance to strike between being ridiculous and being just too stiff. Being the
Mm,
limp fish. And like you said earlier, thinking about how this has this interface with the world of theater. Where pantomime is so popular, and pantomime is of course silent. They're communicating
mm,
with purely gestures. And if everyone's going, from the pantomime theater to the forum, and they have these expectations about why, about the eloquence of gesture, then yeah, you better hit your tone just right, or else you're going to
mhm.
be seen as a bad orator. And delivery, 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 delivery.
Yep.
Well, fascinating stuff. And I guess, thinking about bringing it to the present day, I noticed that myself, a couple times when I was talking, I did this without really thinking about it. And that got me thinking a bit about how gestures are used today. Of course, even by us limp Americans. What parallels do we see in your experience from modern public figures using either ancient, faux ancient, or just sort of gestures in general in their addresses?
Yeah, the modern parallels are interesting. Just on the question of sort of absorbing this yourself, I think all these decades of studying ancient gestures have made me gesticulate a
Mhm.
lot, and I really constantly have to think to restrain myself because I want to be doing all
Oh,
this
wow.
stuff. So I'm always trying to tone it down. But anyway,
Oh, right.
yeah, I mean, if you look at gesture in ancient Rome and then compare it to modern notions of gesticulation, it's a really interesting history because all the way up to about the 19th century, people were intensely interested in delivery and this question
Mhm.
of body gesture. So if you look at people writing about rhetoric in the 1700s or the 1800s or in the Renaissance, they're all really into this. And then as we hit the early 20th century, it kind of stops, and a lot of the reason is that's the exact same time that we get those artificial means of voice amplification. And remember, the
Mhm.
very earliest sort of microphones weren't, little tiny mics. They were these huge stands, and the orator would be hidden his entire body by the voice amplification machinery. So I think about 100 years ago, all of a sudden that became less important because you could no longer see the orator, and the emphasis was on this projection of his voice. But then as we get into the mid 20th century, when all that starts shrinking and you start to get TV and you get people watching this, all of a sudden body language becomes really important again. And now we tend to look at that. And a real turning point was the Nixon debates, where he's sweating
Oh,
visibly, and
right.
everybody commented on this because you could now see close up the orator. But if we look at the basic rules for effective oratory then and now, they're really similar. I mean, all the same kind of stuff that you read about in Cicero apply to what we judge as good public speaking today. So the best
Hmm.
public speakers of the past and today tend to follow those rules laid out in the ancient rhetorical handbooks very, very closely. Just people we tend to regard as good orators commonly use a lot of gestures. Effective speakers are those who are able to arouse the emotions of a crowd, and delivery remains hugely important. Now, that may actually not be always a good thing. We all know that a speech or a professor, if he has an exciting, inspired delivery, you're going to be more entertained by that and like it better, even if the content isn't so great, as opposed to a speech that might have excellent content given in a really dull and boring manner. And maybe even
Hmm.
more unfortunate is that the practitioners of outstanding delivery can use those skills for very different moral purposes. So, from the last 50, 100 years, think, for example, of two figures like Martin Luther King and Adolf Hitler. Both
Hmm.
those guys were highly effective orators. Both are famous for using lots of gestures, and both were absolute masters of arousing their audience's emotions. But of course, one man used those talents for good, and the other used them for evil. So, uh,
Hmm.
these and all the rhetorical techniques we're talking about with Cicero can be very effective in persuading audiences. But I also think this leaves us with some disturbing questions. And some of those questions are things like, are these techniques, are these tricks ethical? Is
Hmm.
this the kind of speech making that you really want to see from a politician? So that's something that's a problem with all of this. But at any rate,
Hmm.
all of it does demonstrate that a lot of things that we sometimes think of as modern, of course, really are not new at all, but were, fully developed techniques thousands of years ago in antiquity.
Oh, that's fascinating. It brings us back to this idea that there's almost a magic in gestures, that
Mhm.
this coaxing power that they employ.
Yep.
And I was just thinking about modern examples. I guess in American history, we always think about like a William Jennings Bryan or something, the Cross of Gold speech, where mimes at the
Yep.
end, being at a cross, everyone loses their mind from just the sheer,
Yep.
the physical impact of that gesture. But even in a more subtle way, right? A good speaker, whether it's Martin Luther King or an Adolf Hitler or someone who's not one of these morally terrifying examples. Right, there's a body language employed that we might not only half recognize unless we're looking for it. And I'm sure you see all the time because you're so conditioned to think of gesture as
Mhm.
its own kind of independent language that works alongside, English or Latin or whatever it might be. But it's fascinating stuff. So anyway, Professor Aldrete, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot. And doing the Tedious, for one thing, that alone has made everything here
It's a
um,
memorable
a
anecdote.
wonderful
Yeah.
boon. It really is. So anyway, to all listeners, Professor Aldrete has written some great books on ancient history and has some wonderful, great courses. You'll find both at his website, GregorySAldrete.com. And so, Greg, thanks again. And to everyone, thanks for listening.
Yep. Thank you very much. This is fun stuff to discuss. As you can tell, I like it. So thank you.
Of course. Thanks again.